She was never supposed to survive the storm. The wind howled across the small Montana shelter like something alive, rattling the old windows hard enough to make the glass tremble in its frame while snow hammered the roof in thick frozen sheets. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low through the night, deep and distant like artillery fading across a battlefield. Inside the shelter, the power flickered once, twice. Then darkness swallowed everything. Only the weak yellow glow of an emergency lantern remained, casting long shadows across the concrete floor and the rows of empty kennels. The air smelled of wet fur, antiseptic, and cold metal. Dr. Claire Bennett pulled her jacket tighter as she knelt beside the trembling German shepherd lying on a pile of old blankets near the back wall. "Easy, girl," she whispered softly, though her voice carried the quiet fear she was trying to hide. The dog barely moved. Luna's sable coat was soaked from the snow, her sides rising in uneven breaths while exhaustion clouded her amber eyes. She had been found 3 hours earlier near the edge of Route 89, wandering alone through the blizzard with a rusted chain still hanging from her collar. Nobody knew where she came from. Nobody knew how long she had been out there. But Claire knew one thing the moment she saw the dog collapse onto the shelter floor. Luna was about to give birth, and she was dangerously weak. A faint whimper escaped the shepherd's throat as another contraction hit. Claire reached for the towel beside her, trying to stay calm while the lantern light danced across the walls. "Come on," she murmured. "Stay with me." Near the doorway, Margaret Hale stood silently with trembling hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. At 62, the shelter owner had seen abandoned animals arrive in every condition imaginable, but something about this dog unsettled her. Maybe it was the strange intelligence in Luna's eyes, or maybe it was the way she kept staring toward the front entrance, as if waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. Outside, tires crunched over fresh snow. Headlights swept across the frozen windows. Margaret blinked. Who in God's name would be driving up here tonight? A truck engine shut off. Moments later, the shelter door groaned open against the wind, and a tall man stepped inside, carrying 2 heavy bags of dog food over one shoulder. Snow clung to the sleeves of his dark canvas jacket, while cold air rushed into the room around him. Ethan Walker looked older than 34. Not because of gray in his short brown hair or the faint scar near his jaw, but because grief had settled permanently behind his hazel eyes. He paused the moment he heard Luna cry. The shepherd lifted her head weakly from the blankets. Their eyes met across the room. And suddenly, for the first time all night, the trembling stopped. Claire noticed it instantly. The dog's breathing slowed. Her panic eased. Even the puppy's movement beneath her ribs seemed calmer somehow. Ethan frowned slightly, setting the bags onto the floor. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. But before Claire could answer, Luna struggled forward through the blankets with what little strength she had left and rested her head gently against Ethan's boot, like she already knew him. Then the emergency lantern flickered again, and somewhere inside the storm-dark shelter, a newborn puppy gave its very first cry. The tiny cry vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the sound of wind clawing against the shelter walls. Claire leaned closer to Luna, her pulse quickening beneath the lantern's dim glow. "I need more towels," she said quietly, but Margaret was already moving, her old boots scraping softly across the concrete floor. Ethan remained frozen beside the blankets, staring down at the exhausted German shepherd resting against his leg. He had spent years teaching himself not to feel too much. War had a way of hardening men slowly, like winter freezing a river inch by inch until nothing underneath could move anymore. But the warmth of Luna's head against his boot stirred something he had buried long ago. The first puppy finally emerged into Claire's trembling hands, small and weak beneath the flickering light. For one terrible second, the room fell silent. No movement, no sound. Claire rubbed the tiny body carefully with the towel, trying to warm him while snow rattled against the windows. "Come on, little guy," she whispered. Ethan watched the veterinarian's face tighten with worry. He had seen that expression before. Medics wore it overseas when hope started slipping away. Luna lifted her head weakly and let out the softest whine. Ethan slowly crouched beside her without thinking. The old dog tag around his neck swung loose beneath his jacket as he reached toward the puppy. "Here," Claire said softly. "Try holding him close to your chest." Ethan hesitated only a moment before taking the tiny shepherd into his large hands. The puppy weighed almost nothing. Fragile, warm, but fading. Ethan could feel the faintest heartbeat against his palm. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains again while the emergency lantern buzzed softly overhead. Then suddenly, the puppy twitched. Claire blinked. Another tiny movement followed. A weak breath escaped the newborn's mouth, followed by a small cry that cut straight through the darkness like the first note of a forgotten song. Margaret covered her mouth quietly. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. Ethan stared down at the puppy as it shifted weakly against his chest. Then something strange happened. The tiny shepherd opened one eye for half a second and pressed its nose directly against the metal dog tags hanging from Ethan's neck. Ethan stiffened instantly. Memories flashed through him before he could stop them. Desert wind, burning sunlight, sand against combat boots, and another German shepherd years ago pressing his nose against those same tags before a patrol. Rex. Ethan swallowed hard and carefully handed the puppy back to Claire. "That is enough for tonight," he muttered quietly, standing too fast. But Luna suddenly growled. Not aggressively, desperately. Ethan turned back. The exhausted mother struggled against the blankets, trying to follow him with frightened eyes. Claire looked up. "She does not want you leaving." Ethan let out a tired breath and slowly sat back down beside her. Almost immediately, Luna relaxed again. The tension left her body little by little while another contraction rolled through her. Claire stared at the shepherd carefully now. "I have never seen anything like this," she whispered. "Her heart rate stabilizes every time you touch her." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Dogs usually like me more than people do." Margaret returned with fresh blankets and paused suddenly near the old wooden shelf beside the supply cabinet. "That is strange," she murmured. Claire glanced up. "What?" Margaret pointed toward Luna's rusted collar lying beside the lantern. "I could swear that symbol was not there before." Ethan reached for the collar slowly. Beneath years of dirt and scratches, a faded military insignia was barely visible in the metal. His expression changed instantly. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. His thumb brushed across the emblem while the storm howled louder outside. "No," he whispered under his breath. Claire frowned. "What is it?" Ethan looked toward Luna, whose tired amber eyes never left his face. Then another puppy cried out into the darkness. And this time, the sound made the old Marine's blood run cold. The second puppy arrived smaller than the first, its tiny body trembling beneath Claire's careful hands while the storm continued raging beyond the shelter walls. Snow hissed against the windows now, driven sideways by the wind hard enough to blur the world outside into a white, ghostly haze. The old building groaned softly with every gust, but inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan still stared at the faded insignia carved into Luna's rusted collar as though the metal itself had reached back through time and grabbed hold of him. His thumb brushed over the worn symbol again. Eagle, globe, anchor, and beneath it, nearly erased by years and weather, 3 letters. RKX. Ethan's breathing slowed. Claire noticed his hands trembling slightly in the lantern light. "You know what that means," she said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "Rex." The name lingered in the cold air between them. Margaret frowned softly. "That was your dog?" Ethan nodded once, still staring at the collar. "Military K9. Explosives detection. Best partner I ever had." His voice remained steady, but grief sat underneath every word like a wound that had never healed correctly. Claire gently wrapped the second puppy in a towel, while Luna watched every movement with exhausted eyes. The mother shepherd looked weaker now, yet strangely peaceful whenever Ethan stayed close beside her. It was almost as if she trusted him more than her own fear. Another puppy cried softly from the blankets, and Luna instinctively shifted toward the sound despite her exhaustion. Ethan slowly crouched beside her again. "Easy girl," he whispered. "You are doing fine." The shepherd pressed her head against his arm. The simple gesture hit him harder than he expected. Years ago, Rex used to do the same thing before patrols overseas whenever Ethan's nerves started tightening too much. One quiet nudge, one reminder that he was not alone. Claire studied the interaction carefully while checking the newborn puppies one by one. Then her expression changed. "Margaret," she said softly, "bring the lantern closer." The older woman stepped forward carefully, holding the flickering light above the blankets. Claire gently turned the first puppy onto its side. Ethan leaned closer. For a moment, nobody breathed. Across the puppy's chest, hidden beneath damp fur, was a dark marking shaped almost perfectly like the same military insignia carved into Luna's collar. Claire blinked once in disbelief. That cannot be coincidence. Margaret slowly lowered herself into the nearby chair. Lord have mercy. Ethan stared silently at the tiny marking while memories pressed against him from every direction. Desert heat, dust storms, long nights under foreign stars, and Rex lying beside him after missions, exhausted but loyal until the very end. He remembered the last day most clearly. The silence afterward, the empty leash, the folded flag. Ethan had spent 4 years trying not to think about any of it. Yet now, in the middle of a snowstorm inside a forgotten animal shelter, those memories stood alive in front of him again through a dying German shepherd and her newborn pups. Then the third puppy arrived. Unlike the others, this one did not cry at all. Claire's expression darkened immediately. She rubbed the tiny shepherd gently with the towel, trying to warm him while Luna whimpered weakly beside her. Ethan watched the veterinarian's face and recognized that look again. The same terrible uncertainty medics carried when hope started slipping away. Claire listened carefully for breathing. Nothing. The storm outside suddenly fell strangely quiet, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Ethan slowly removed the old dog tags from around his neck and placed them carefully beside the motionless puppy. "Come on, little man," he whispered softly. "Do not quit now." For one long second, nothing happened. Then the puppy's tiny paw twitched toward the metal tags. The tiny paw rested against the cold metal dog tags, as if searching for something familiar hidden deep inside them. Claire held perfectly still beside the lantern, barely breathing while the weak newborn lay wrapped in the towel between her hands. Then, at last, the smallest sound escaped the puppy's chest. A faint breath. Fragile. Shaking. Alive. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, while snow continued falling beyond the shelter windows in thick, swirling waves. Ethan stared at the tiny shepherd, unable to move. His chest felt tight in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Slowly, the puppy shifted again, pressing closer toward the tags hanging partly across the blanket. Claire blinked in disbelief. That should not have worked. Ethan gave a tired look toward her. Maybe he just needed a reason. Luna let out a soft, exhausted sigh from the blankets beside them, her amber eyes half closed now, but calmer than before. The shepherd watched the newborn carefully, ears twitching weakly every time one of the puppies made a sound. Despite her condition, she still tried to pull herself closer to them, driven by the same quiet instinct that kept mothers fighting long after their strength should have failed. Claire gently placed the smallest puppy beside his brothers beneath a warming blanket while the lantern crackled softly overhead. The storm outside had eased slightly now, though the wind still moaned through the pine trees surrounding the shelter like distant voices carrying across the mountain. Ethan remained kneeling beside Luna, absently rubbing the fur along her neck while his thoughts drifted somewhere far away. He remembered another freezing night overseas nearly 6 years earlier. Another German shepherd lying beside him beneath a broken concrete wall while dust storms rolled across the desert horizon. Rex had always known when Ethan's mind started slipping into dark places. The dog never needed commands for that. One quiet nudge against his shoulder, one steady breath beside him in the dark. Somehow that had always been enough. Claire interrupted the silence carefully. "You never told me what happened to him." Ethan's hand paused against Luna's fur. For a long moment, only the sound of sleeping puppies filled the room. Then he finally spoke. "We were stationed near Kandahar. Recon mission." Storm rolled in fast. His voice remained calm, but his eyes no longer seemed fully present inside the shelter. Visibility dropped almost to nothing. Rex found something buried near an abandoned road before any of us stepped closer. Claire listened quietly while Margaret lowered herself into the old wooden chair beside the lantern. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. "He saved 6 Marines that day." The room fell silent again. Claire noticed the way Ethan avoided saying anything more after that. People who carried real grief usually did. They learned to speak around pain instead of through it. Luna slowly lifted her head and nudged Ethan's arm again, as though she understood every word he could not say aloud. Then suddenly, one of the puppies began whining softly beneath the blanket. Claire leaned closer immediately. That is strange. Ethan looked down. The firstborn puppy had somehow crawled nearly 6 inches across the blankets despite barely being minutes old. Tiny paws pushed weakly forward until he reached Ethan's leg. Then the puppy stopped moving completely and fell asleep against his boot. Margaret stared at the scene in quiet amazement. I have worked in shelters almost 30 years, she whispered. I have never seen newborns act like this. Claire carefully examined the markings on each puppy again beneath the lantern light. Every single one carried some variation of the same dark shape along the chest or shoulder. Not identical, but close enough to make her skin prickle with unease. One resembled the old military insignia almost perfectly. Another looked more like a faded star. The smallest pup carried a thin dark stripe, curved almost exactly like the emblem carved into Ethan's dog tags. Claire leaned back slowly. There is something about this litter. Ethan looked toward Luna again. The shepherd's tired eyes met his calmly now, no fear left in them at all. Only trust, deep and unwavering. Then Margaret suddenly stood up from the chair, her coffee mug trembling in her hands as she stared toward the back storage hallway. Wait here, she said softly. Ethan frowned. What is it? The older woman looked pale beneath the lantern glow. I just remembered something. She disappeared down the dark hallway while the wind rattled the shelter roof overhead once more. Nearly a minute passed before she returned carrying a dusty cardboard box clutched carefully against her chest. Her hands shook as she lowered it onto the floor beside Ethan. Claire brushed dust away from the lid while Luna watched silently from the blankets. Then Margaret opened the box. Inside, beneath old shelter records and faded photographs, rested a military service file with one familiar word printed across the top in black letters. Rex. The old cardboard box smelled faintly of dust, cedar, and time. Margaret lowered herself slowly beside it while the lantern light flickered across the shelter walls, casting trembling shadows over the sleeping puppies curled against Luna's side. Outside, the storm had softened into a steady whisper of falling snow, but inside the room, the silence felt heavier now. Ethan stared at the military file resting in the box as though opening it might awaken something he had spent years trying to bury. Claire sat quietly beside the blankets, one hand resting gently against the smallest puppy's back to keep him warm. Luna watched all of them carefully, her tired amber eyes never leaving Ethan for long. Margaret swallowed once before speaking. This came in almost 5 years ago. Ethan looked up slowly. What do you mean? The older woman brushed her fingers across the edge of the worn file. A man dropped it off here during a snowstorm. Late at night. Never gave his name. Claire frowned softly. Why would someone bring military records to an animal shelter? Margaret opened the folder carefully. Inside were faded photographs, veterinary papers, and old service records stamped with Marine Corps markings. One photograph slid loose onto the floor beside Ethan's boot. He picked it up slowly. The moment he saw it, his breathing stopped. Rex stared back at him from the old photograph, younger and strong, sitting proudly beside another German shepherd Ethan had never seen before. A female. Sable coat. Amber eyes. Luna. Ethan looked toward the exhausted mother lying beside the puppies. No, he whispered softly. That is impossible. Claire leaned closer to the photograph. That is her. Margaret nodded slowly. The man said she disappeared after a transfer between military facilities. Nobody could locate her afterward. Ethan's pulse hammered quietly in his chest now. He looked back down at the image. Rex and Luna sat side by side beneath a faded American flag, while a group of Marines stood behind them smiling beneath desert sunlight. Written across the bottom corner in black ink were 4 simple words. Kandahar Unit 7. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That had been his unit. His hand tightened around the photograph. I never knew Rex had a partner, he said quietly. They separated handlers during deployment rotations sometimes, Margaret explained softly. Especially breeding candidates for future K9 lines. Claire's eyes widened slightly as realization settled across her face. You think these puppies, Margaret nodded once, might be Rex's bloodline. The room fell silent except for the soft breathing of sleeping newborns. Ethan looked toward the tiny puppies curled against Luna's chest. The markings, the way they reacted to his voice, the way Luna trusted him instantly. None of it felt random anymore. Claire carefully lifted the smallest puppy for another examination beneath the lantern. "There is more," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "What?" Claire turned the puppy gently in her hands. Beneath the soft fur along his shoulder rested another tiny dark marking Ethan had not noticed before. Not an insignia this time. A shape. A number. 7. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. Unit 7. The same unit printed beneath the photograph in his hand. A cold shiver moved through him despite the warmth of the shelter. "That cannot happen naturally," Claire murmured softly. Luna suddenly lifted her head again and gave a low, restless whine toward the hallway leading deeper into the shelter. Ethan immediately noticed the change in her posture. "What is it, girl?" The shepherd's ears twitched sharply. Then she struggled weakly to stand despite Claire trying to calm her. "Easy," Claire whispered. "You just gave birth." But Luna kept staring toward the dark hallway with growing urgency. Her breathing quickened. The puppies began whining softly beside her, as if sensing the same thing. Ethan slowly stood and listened. At first, he heard nothing except the old pipes rattling gently behind the walls. Then came another sound. Faint. Metallic. Somewhere deeper inside the shelter. Margaret's face suddenly drained of color. "That storage room," she whispered. Claire looked up sharply. "What about it?" Margaret clutched the old military file tightly against her chest. "The man who brought Luna here years ago." Her voice trembled now. "He left something else behind, too." Ethan grabbed the lantern immediately while Luna let out another anxious whine from the blankets. Then somewhere beyond the dark hallway, hidden behind the old storage door, something shifted softly in the darkness. Ethan lifted the lantern higher as he stepped carefully toward the dark hallway while the weak yellow light trembled against the shelter walls. The old floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots, and somewhere behind him, Luna let out another uneasy whine from the blankets beside her newborn puppies. Claire stayed close behind Ethan while Margaret moved slower, gripping the old military file tightly against her chest as if afraid it might disappear if she loosened her hold for even a second. The deeper they moved into the hallway, the colder the air became. Dust floated through the lantern glow like drifting snow. Old shelves lined the narrow corridor, stacked with broken carriers, rusted bowls, and faded donation boxes untouched for years. Then the metallic sound came again. Soft, hollow, like something lightly striking against steel. Ethan stopped walking immediately. Claire looked toward him. "You hear that?" He nodded once. The sound came from behind the last storage door at the far end of the hallway. Luna suddenly barked from the main room. One sharp, desperate bark that echoed through the shelter. Ethan reached the door slowly and wrapped his hand around the cold metal knob. The wood groaned loudly as he pushed it open. A wave of stale air rolled out carrying the scent of dust, cedar, and old paper. The room beyond was small and cluttered, lit only by the lantern in Ethan's hand. Tarps covered stacks of forgotten supplies while cobwebs stretched across shelves along the walls. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire noticed it first. There, in the far corner of the room, sat an old military kennel partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp. The metal crate was scratched badly with age, but one detail remained visible beneath the dust. U.S. Marine Corps K-9 Unit 7. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. He moved closer without speaking while Margaret slowly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Hanging from the side of the kennel was another rusted collar, smaller than Luna's. Ethan crouched beside it carefully. His lantern illuminated faded letters engraved into the worn metal tag. Luna. The shepherd in the other room began whining louder now, as if she knew exactly what they had found. Claire looked around the storage room carefully. Why would all this still be here? Margaret swallowed hard before answering. The man who brought her told me never to throw any of it away. Ethan glanced toward her. Did he say why? Margaret shook her head slowly. Only that one day the right Marine would come back for her. Silence settled over the room. Ethan stared at the old kennel while memories flooded through him faster now. He remembered seeing another handler briefly during deployment rotations overseas. A female shepherd standing beside Rex near the transport trucks while helicopters thundered overhead in the desert heat. Luna. He had forgotten her name after all these years. Or maybe he had forced himself to forget because remembering hurt too much. Claire slowly lifted a folded blanket from inside the kennel. Beneath it rested something wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Ethan frowned and reached for the bundle. The fabric crackled softly as he opened it beneath the lantern light. Inside lay an old leather leash, military commendation papers, and one sealed envelope yellowed by time. Written across the front in faded black ink were 6 words. For Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker. Ethan froze completely. Claire stared at him in disbelief. That was meant for you. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. Snow hissed softly against the shelter roof overhead, while somewhere behind them, the newborn puppies began crying together in the distance. Ethan slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The paper shook faintly between his fingers as he began reading the first line beneath the lantern glow. If Luna ever finds her way back to you, it means Rex kept his promise. Ethan read the line again beneath the trembling lantern glow while the storm whispered softly against the shelter roof above them. If Luna ever finds her way back to you, it means Rex kept his promise. His throat tightened instantly. The old paper shook faintly between his fingers as memories he had fought for years to bury came rushing back with painful clarity. Claire watched him carefully from beside the kennel while Margaret remained silent near the doorway, her tired eyes shining with quiet emotion. Ethan slowly unfolded the rest of the letter. The handwriting was rough but steady, written by someone used to military reports more than personal words. Captain Samuel Reeves. Ethan recognized the name immediately. Rex and Luna's commanding officer overseas. The letter continued. Rex bonded with Luna faster than any K9 pair we ever trained. During your final deployment, we discovered Luna was carrying a litter. Military command ordered her transfer stateside before the mission near Kandahar. Rex became impossible to control after she left. He searched every transport truck for 3 straight days. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He remembered that. Back then he thought Rex had simply sensed the tension before deployment. He never knew the dog had been grieving. The lantern crackled softly overhead while newborn puppies whimpered somewhere down the hallway. Ethan forced himself to continue reading. Before the mission, Rex stayed outside my tent almost the entire night. Would not eat. Would not sleep. Then he took your tags in his mouth and walked them to Luna's empty kennel. I have never seen anything like it before or since. Claire slowly lowered herself beside Ethan while he read the next lines in silence. If anything ever happened to Rex, I promised myself Luna and her bloodline would find their way back to the only Marine he truly trusted. Some bonds do not end when service does. Ethan stared at the final sentence for a long moment after the letter ended. The old shelter seemed impossibly quiet now except for the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside. Then suddenly, his composure broke. Ethan lowered his head slowly, one rough hand covering his eyes while years of buried grief finally surfaced all at once. Claire did not speak. Neither did Margaret. Some pain was too sacred for interruption. Luna whined softly from the other room, sensing him somehow even from down the hallway. Ethan let out a shaking breath. I left him there, he whispered quietly. Claire looked toward him. You could not have. Ethan shook his head slowly. I should have gone back. His voice cracked slightly beneath the weight of words carried too long alone. The storm came in fast. We got separated during extraction. They told me there was no chance anyone survived after the collapse. He swallowed hard. But Rex kept searching for me anyway. Tears finally slid down Ethan's face despite every effort to stop them. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the quiet breaking of a man who had spent too many years pretending he no longer hurt. Claire gently rested one hand against his shoulder while the lantern glow softened across the old storage room. He never blamed you, she whispered. Ethan stared at the photograph again. Rex beside Luna beneath desert sunlight. Loyal until the very end. Somewhere behind them, one of the puppies barked suddenly. Tiny. Sharp. Ethan wiped his eyes quickly and stood. The moment he stepped back into the hallway, Luna lifted her head from the blankets and stared directly at him. Her exhausted tail tapped weakly against the floor once. Then the smallest puppy crawled out from beneath the blanket pile again, still barely able to move, still fragile from birth, yet somehow determined. The little shepherd dragged himself inch by inch across the blankets until he reached Ethan's boot once more. Then he curled against it peacefully and fell asleep. Ethan slowly knelt beside him. The puppy's breathing was calm now. Safe. Trusted. Claire watched the scene quietly while dawn's first pale light began creeping faintly through the storm clouds outside the shelter windows. The night was finally ending. Ethan gently touched the tiny puppy's back with trembling fingers. "You kept your promise, buddy," he whispered softly into the quiet room. Luna closed her eyes at the sound of his voice. And for the first time in years, the old Marine no longer felt alone. Dawn arrived slowly over the Montana mountains, pale silver light spilling across the snowdrifts outside the shelter windows, while the storm finally loosened its grip on the world. Inside, the air felt warmer now, softer somehow. The emergency lanterns still glowed faintly beside the blankets, though morning sunlight had begun creeping through the frosted glass in thin golden lines. Luna slept peacefully for the first time since Ethan arrived, her breathing calm and steady while the newborn puppies nestled close against her side. The smallest one remained curled against Ethan's boot like he had claimed it as the safest place in the world. Claire sat near the old wood stove wrapped in a gray blanket, exhaustion visible beneath her tired eyes as she quietly filled out medical notes on a clipboard. Margaret moved slowly through the shelter carrying fresh water bowls, humming an old church hymn under her breath while snowmelt dripped softly from the roof outside. For the first time in years, the building no longer felt abandoned. Ethan remained seated on the floor beside Luna, absently rubbing the puppy's tiny back with one rough finger while Rex's old photograph rested beside him. He had not slept all night, but strangely, he no longer felt tired. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over water after a storm finally passes. Luna stirred softly and opened her amber eyes. The moment she saw Ethan still sitting there, her tail brushed weakly against the blanket once. Ethan smiled faintly. "Morning, girl." Claire glanced up from across the room. "She is stronger already." Ethan looked toward the veterinarian. "You really think she is going to make it?" Claire's expression softened. "Last night I was not sure." She looked toward the puppies nursing beside Luna. "Now I think she finally has a reason to stay." Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. He understood that feeling better than most people ever would. Margaret suddenly stopped near the front window and frowned toward the snowy road outside. "Looks like somebody's coming." Ethan stood slowly and moved beside her. In the distance, a dark pickup truck crawled carefully up the mountain road through the snow. The shelter rarely received visitors this early, especially after a storm like last night's. Claire stepped closer. "Do you know them?" Margaret shook her head. The truck finally pulled into the shelter lot and stopped. A tall older man stepped out wearing a heavy brown coat and Marine Corps cap, faded from years of use. Even from the window, Ethan recognized the posture instantly. Military. The man paused when he saw Ethan standing inside the doorway. Then his eyes shifted toward Luna, lying beside the puppies. The color drained slowly from his face. "No way," he whispered through the glass. Moments later, the shelter door opened with a burst of cold mountain air. Snow clung to the stranger's boots while his weathered eyes locked onto Luna like he was staring at a ghost. Ethan stepped forward cautiously. "Can I help you?" The older Marine looked toward him carefully. "Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker?" Ethan froze. "How do you know my name?" The man removed his gloves slowly, emotion already building behind his tired eyes. "Because I wrote the letter." Silence filled the shelter instantly. Claire stared at him in shock, while Margaret lowered her hand to her chest. The man's gaze shifted back toward Luna and the puppies. "Captain Reeves," he said quietly. "Retired now." Ethan's pulse quickened as memories connected all at once. The voice from old radio briefings. The commanding officer who signed Rex's service reports overseas. Reeves stepped slowly toward Luna, careful not to frighten her. The shepherd lifted her head weakly and stared at him for one long second before gently wagging her tail. The old Marine let out a broken breath and dropped to one knee beside her. "Good girl," he whispered shakily. "You finally made it home." Then his eyes drifted toward the puppies nursing against her side. He noticed the markings immediately. The old insignias. The dark number 7 along the smallest pup's shoulder. Reeves looked back at Ethan with tears forming quietly in his eyes. "Rex waited for you until his very last day," he said softly. "And before he died, he lay beside Luna's kennel every single night." Ethan swallowed hard while the smallest puppy slowly lifted its tiny head and crawled once again toward his boot. Reeves stared at the scene in silence before whispering something almost too quiet to hear. "Some promises," he said, "even death does not break." 3 weeks later, the mountain snow had begun to melt along the edges of Route 89, leaving thin rivers of silver water winding through the pine trees below the shelter hill. Morning sunlight spilled warmly across the old building now, no longer cold or forgotten like before. The cracked wooden sign above the entrance had been replaced with fresh white letters painted carefully by hand. Rex and Luna Rescue. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the porch roof while the scent of pine, coffee, and clean straw drifted softly through the open doorway. Inside, the shelter no longer felt empty. Puppies tumbled clumsily across blankets near the front desk, their tiny paws too big for their bodies, while Luna rested nearby watching them with calm amber eyes. She had regained her strength slowly over the past weeks, though she never strayed far from Ethan for long. Everywhere he walked, she followed quietly beside him like she had already decided where she belonged. Claire stood near the exam table, smiling faintly, as the smallest puppy barked proudly at his own reflection in a metal food bowl. "He thinks he is twice his size," she laughed softly. Ethan leaned against the doorway holding a bag of dog food over one shoulder, while morning sunlight touched the tired lines near his eyes. Something inside him had changed since that stormy night. The grief was still there. Some losses never fully leave, but it no longer hollowed him out from the inside. The nightmares had stopped 3 nights ago. For the first time in years, silence no longer frightened him. Captain Reeves sat quietly near the window, turning an old Marine Corps coin slowly between his fingers while watching the puppies play across the floor. "Rex would have loved this," he murmured. Ethan looked toward the old Marine and nodded once. "I think somehow he already does." The smallest puppy suddenly stumbled across the room toward Ethan's boots again, tail wagging wildly with determination despite tripping over his own oversized paws twice along the way. Ethan crouched and scooped him gently into his arms. The little shepherd immediately pressed his nose against the old dog tags hanging around Ethan's neck, just like he had done the night he was born. Claire shook her head softly in amazement. "Still doing that?" Ethan smiled faintly while scratching behind the puppy's tiny ears. "Some habits run in the family." Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the valley below, while sunlight shimmered across the melting snowfields. Margaret stepped onto the porch carrying fresh towels and paused when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, holding the puppy against his chest. Luna sat beside him calmly, her tail brushing lightly against the wooden floorboards. Together they looked less like strangers brought together by chance, and more like something that had been quietly guided home all along. Margaret smiled softly. "You know," she said, "I think this shelter waited a long time for all of you." Ethan looked down at the puppy sleeping peacefully in his arms. The dark number 7 remained visible along the little shepherd's shoulder beneath the morning light. A reminder, a promise carried forward. Luna rested her head gently against Ethan's leg while the other puppies chased each other clumsily across the blankets behind them. For a moment, nobody spoke. The world outside remained quiet except for wind moving gently through the pines and distant birdsong drifting across the mountains. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the clean morning air while sunlight warmed his face. Then he looked toward the horizon where winter clouds had finally broken apart above the valley. "Funny thing about loyalty," he said softly. "Sometimes it finds its way back to you when you stop believing you deserve it." Captain Reeves lowered his eyes quietly while Claire brushed tears from her cheek near the exam table. Luna simply stayed beside Ethan, steady and silent as always. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beneath the same endless sky they once crossed together long ago, it felt almost possible that an old war dog had finally found peace knowing the promise he made had been kept.